I'm Dr. Marcia Sonity,
And I'm Dr. Caleb Moore,
and this is
the Free Smiles Podcast. Today in this episode, we are going to discuss same day versus laboratory fabricated crowns. I don't know why I said that, so
It was perfect. The way you said it was perfect.
it was actually perfect. So basically discussing CEREC crowns versus crowns we send out to the lab.
Yep.
What are you doing in your office?
So my office, so before I came on, like years ago, they had a mill, an older one, but they had one. And then they went back essentially to a local lab to fabricate our crowns.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think when I think about a crown that's made in 2 hours, like, can you actually make a crown in a 2-hour appointment? Is that possible?
I mean, so. This is my stance. This is how I feel about it. Is that I think there are great doctors that are really good with the design part of things, the milling part, and they're really good with just the nuances of that.
Yeah.
And I think you can have a really good result. I think that takes time and skill and energy to do and to get to that point, because you can mill zirconia, but if you think about it, there's a lot of labs that are using a similar type of system to mill crowns. It's just at a bigger caliber or a little bit different, and there's more obviously nuances to that. So I think it's possible. I think it's not as predictable as maybe a really good lab, and obviously not all labs are created equal as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are definitely some specifics that I want to dive into today on why laboratory fabricated crowns are more predictable.
Mhm.
But let's start off with why are we doing crowns in the first place? What are crowns? When are you recommending them? What are you looking out for? Why are you doing crowns for patients?
Yeah, so I would say there's a few reasons why we would recommend a crown, or why a crown would be the certain, restoration for that tooth. A lot of times it's going to be a tooth that's cracked or fracturing.
Mm-hmm.
There's an existing very large restoration, or it's had multiple restorations over its lifetime, where now more of the tooth is a filling than it is regular tooth structure. So the rule is that if you have more than 3/4 of the cusp, or kind of the top part of the tooth widthwise, that is a tooth filling, then you'd probably recommend a crown at that point. So that's when I'm looking at something and I'm saying, hey, we have recurrent decay here. We should really consider doing a crown at this point, because if I take this filling out of there, then I'm taking away more tooth when I'm removing the decay from this tooth.
Mm-hmm.
And then really we're left with a shell that's more likely going to fracture and break. So it's putting the tooth possibly in a weaker state if we just treat with a new filling and removing of the decay. That's most of the time. Obviously, there's aesthetic reasons why we're choosing a veneer over a crown. I think in this situation, the nuance of a veneer versus a crown is just what coverage we're getting. I'm not going to go into like the prep design of that at this point. Yes.
I think it depends. It's situationally based, right? And like you said, it's a cascade of events. When a tooth has had a cavity and then they have recurrent decay, which sometimes is inevitable, and it's all dependent on the patient. And then we're redoing that filling, and then 10 years later, okay, now it's time for a crown. Like you said, it's because the tooth structurally needs the support. And I think, for a lot of people, they don't understand the difference, the tangible, like what you actually can feel, the difference between zirconia or even an Emax, but any sort of crown or an indirect restoration versus a direct restoration. One thing that I like to do in my office is we have it's almost like the size of a penny, and it's a composite that we just molded and then hardened. Mm-hmm. And then we have like a sample, like a crown that didn't fit on a patient, and we were able to keep it. But I will hand them both to the patient and say, you can feel the difference. This material is made up of, filler particles, and it's more of a glass. It's not as strong. And this right here is a zirconia. It's like a metal. It's going to support your tooth and last a really long time. And so I think that having that in your hand and knowing being able to feel the difference, it's huge. It's huge for
Yeah, I
patients.
think that's actually kind of, a pretty, not even like revolutionary. That's a pretty like a simple thing that you can, just to
Yeah.
kind of show a patient like the difference of it. A lot of patients understand the difference between plastic and porcelain,
Yep.
but then there's, if you want to go a step further, kind of having that like tactile sensitivity of the two different things. I try to give like a, yeah, like a real world example of why they're different and what we're trying to achieve.
Hmm.
And, again, we're going back to the conversation of, are we trying to be reactive later? Are we trying to be
Yeah.
proactive now and actually have more of a long-term solution? Sometimes a filling sounds like, okay, I just want this taken care of right now. This is what, like, where I'm at. But are we setting ourselves up for more problems and more dental work and probable possible loss of tooth
Yep.
down the road if we're not supporting that tooth the proper way? And sometimes that doesn't mean a full coverage crown. That can be a three-quarter crown or
Hmm.
an onlay or something like that. And I think there's nuances to each practitioner of what their, you know, perspective is in that. But I think there's no wrong answer when it comes to full coverage, in my opinion, because I think it's just what works best in your hands and what you're comfortable with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's dive into CEREC crowns. It's funny that we're talking about this today because neither of us actually do CEREC crowns, right?
Yeah, just
Um,
intermittently, I've done it with like an office I was kind of like partially kind of helping out with, and when I was a hygienist,
yes.
the office that I worked with was doing in-house milling.
I guess I should rephrase that.
Yeah.
We aren't currently, but we
Hmm.
have.
Yeah.
Back when I was in Columbus, Ohio, I did for a while, and there are a lot of benefits to that. I think some of the benefits that come to mind for me are patients who may have increased sensitivity or anxiety. Um, because if it's one appointment, you're
Hmm.
in, you're out. Some patients really love that.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of people in that boat, they don't do well with temporaries. Like
Yeah.
if they're highly sensitive and they want that final restoration right away, it's good. It's a good solution. It's a good solution for them, and they don't have to come back in twice.
Mhm.
Especially if they're going to want nitrous, or they're very anxious about what's going on, and they're like, I'm really sensitive and I've never liked the process of this. I think a CEREC is a great option for them.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
So, but along with that, there are downsides to that, and I think a lot of them go back to what you were saying in terms of training.
Mhm.
Because I mean, let's break it down overall. Let's just have a conversation about crowns. What do we look at? What are we looking for to create a successful crown? Like, what are some of the things that you're looking at when you get that crown back from the lab, or if you
Mhm.
just milled it? What are you looking at?
So, I mean, I try to just set up my crown seat to be the simplest part of it. I want my crown. I mean, I schedule a certain amount of time, but in my mind, I know if I'm in and out within 30 minutes. That means that I prepped really well. I made sure I smoothed all my margins.
Hmm.
My first part of that is just prep day, making sure that, you know, I'm taking that extra couple of minutes just to look around everything, making sure everything looks really nice and smooth. I'm going back with a really fine diamond at the end just to smooth all my margins off, make sure the adjacent teeth don't have like really weird undercuts or even, an existing restoration next to a tooth can really
Hmm.
make your final crown just not have the right kind of contact or it's wavy or has something weird with it. So I'm big on polishing adjacent teeth if needed because to me that's going to set up just my contacts to be perfect as well.
Yeah.
So I'm big on where's my prep, how's my margin looking, um, and I do try to be as minimal as possible with my preps. I'm probably considered more conservative when it comes to my practice of how my assistants are used to preps looking like. So and it makes their temporaries maybe a little bit different or trying to adjust to that.
Hmm.
But to me, it's all about setting that tooth up to be, especially if it's a young patient, this is their first crown on this tooth. I want to be as conservative as possible and make that as minimal as possible. So that's part of that. With my assisting team, they're amazing. So they'll do the initial like crown, the temporary removal,
Yeah.
try in the crown for us. We look at the model. Obviously, when a crown comes back, they're sending us just a little kind of model of the design. And if that's looking really good on the model, we're looking at it. It's glossing really nice on the model. It should translate pretty easily into the mouth as well. So they're cleaning that off for us. Typically, we don't have to numb. With the use of ozone and certain desensitizers, I have found that it's just, when we go to do that crown seat, I don't have sensitivity with
Yeah,
my patients, which is nice. So we're taking that off. They're trying it in. They're doing minimal adjustments kind of proximally. I would say the lab that I'm currently using, I haven't had to do a lot of proximal, just even
amazing.
a touch ups, which has been lovely. I think part of that is because of digital scanning as well. I think we get really accurate scans with digital. There's kind of pros and cons. I think maybe we'll talk about PVS versus digital
Yep.
scanning. And again, I think it's about what's good in your hands, but I think the lab also has there's pros and cons. We'll go back to that. So yeah.
I think so. One thing that's similar with CEREC crowns and also crowns made in the lab is the beginning, the prep work,
Hmm.
right? And I think that comes down to the clinician because even in our office, we just had a representative from Trios. We use the Trio scanner come in, do a training, and they're like, well, what's the prep work look like? What is the doctor creating? And what do the margins look like? Are they using the features that Trios has, like clearance and marking your margins, especially if the margin is a little deeper, maybe on the mesial? And we were in there clinically, we can go in and mark, you can measure that and you can let the lab know and communicate that. So I think there's a lot of similarities in the sense of what we are currently using, the technology to then communicate with the lab is the same as what you'd be doing with a CEREC. However, along with that, I think where the disadvantage comes in is like you were talking about, your team then who's trying to do 5 other things throughout the office that day has to worry about milling that crown.
Mhm.
So instead of having somebody who has had, the education, the knowledge, the training, or not even that because our team is educated as well, but the time, they have the time allotted to sit down and give that their full attention.
Yeah.
Whenever we mill with a CEREC, I don't have a model to check on.
Yeah. Right.
There's
Yeah.
it's
You're
not
gonna be
coming back
trying.
with a model. I have to try it in the mouth, trial and error, and hope that it's going to
No,
fit,
properly.
mill
Yeah, and
properly,
I
right?
think, the one thing I kind of noticed is like doctors that are I think that we could be really successful with CEREC. Obviously, there's different types of preps you need to do for certain materials. Like you want
Hmm.
like a chamfer versus a shoulder and things like that that are going to make your end result that more predictable. I found in the CEREC crowns that I milled with that Emax material, the final crown tends to have more of like a kind of almost like a chamfer type internal component to it
Yeah,
versus having like a straight um like a shoulder
like a
type
shoulder.
margin, which you know here nor there. I think there's nuances to that, and I think you can have a really nice like conservative onlay that you mill in house. I think that's harder to do when you're trying to do something as like an inlay or something like that. It's harder to then you have to professionalize that,
Yep.
and it's a little more, yeah. So if you're an office that does a lot of onlays and inlays, I think it makes more sense to have a CEREC because to provisionalize a few teeth in a row that are then going to be like internal porcelains later, I feel like it's really hard. But for full coverage, I think there's an argument that a lab crown, in my opinion, the time to sit there to design it, to find my margin, like to do all those things, I did enough where yeah, I could probably get better at it, more proficient. But did I love doing that? No. And then where's your assistant staff at? Because they're going to be doing
Exactly.
most of that as you kind of ramp things up as well.
I think I think to your point, it does add value to what they're doing and how their day is going. I find that my assistants really enjoy when I not really give them another task, but give them
Mhm.
an opportunity to learn something new
Yep.
and to just utilize, their skills. Because it feels really good when they go in there and then they're milling this crown and they're staining and they're adding the
Mhm.
color. Like I remember my EFTA at the time in Columbus, she's like, are we milling any like crowns today? Like, I'm so excited to do it. She was so good at it to the
Yep.
point where I didn't even have to worry. But the reality of that is that's time away from being in the operatory. So how are we navigating and balancing that? Because if we have a 2-hour time block for this crown and she's taking 25 minutes of that to be at the mill, that it's okay, but the patient needs to understand that you're going to be sitting here, you're going to be waiting.
Yeah.
Are you okay with that? Just you're going to be chilling in here, maybe watching some Netflix. But I think that it's just a very different setup that some people aren't used to.
Yeah.
And the assistants, we never want them to feel overwhelmed or stressed to do that in office. Something else that you had mentioned about different types of preps, like 3/4 crowns or veneers. For me, I have found that sending it off to a lab has been just very beneficial for a lot of ways. But what has been your experience when you are completing these maybe non-traditional crown preps? How are you communicating with your lab to get good results?
Yeah. So again, my biggest thing is my workflow for that. Like I'm very specific because I am big on digital scanning. I think it is more accurate, especially when you get to know your technology that you're working with, because it's different than taking a PBS impression.
Yeah.
So to me, when it comes to like how am I packing cord after I'm prepping, so I have a little bit of a different workflow. So I'm doing my initial prep. If there's decay, excavating that, doing a buildup, all that stuff. And then sometimes if the decay or the prep has to be close enough to the gingival margin, I'm going to pick and choose, do I want to use, 2 00s? Do I want to use a 0 and a 0? Do I want to use a 0 and a 1, depending on the tissue type? Because do I want to come back in and refine that prep a little bit before I'm doing that final scan? Or do I want to have that initial cord sit by the tissue and just pack it in a little bit, do my initial scan, then take my cord out, and then do a refinement scan.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I've been doing it. And I have found, I think that's why my designs with my lab are pretty much seamless at this point, because I'm very specific of how my assistants are amazing. They pack cord very well. And then my way to use the trios, we use the trios for our prep scans and our restorative scans, because I think it is more accurate. I mean, the field of view, the depth of view is so much better. And you can actually I can get my margins that happen to be, subgingival or, near that because of certain situations. And it does capture it really well. But when I'm doing those, to me, I think the difference of your margin and capture on a digital is all about how you're packing cord.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
No, I agree. So after you have your prep day and the tooth is prepped, you're scanning with your digital scanner. What I have found is we should spend a lot of time there, right? Like that's where we should spend the most time, because if we're setting it up well, it's going to be successful. However, there are other things that we need to communicate with the lab.
Yes.
I love that you're packing cord. I pack cord every single time. I know that people use retraction paste.
I've tried it, and for some, I
Yes.
think it has its place. I still don't think it's a replacement though for like most situations, unless you are like pretty much super gingival for a situation. Then it doesn't matter. You're just kind of like evaluate like bleeding and things like that. But to me, it just depends on the situation. There are certain times where I love it, and there's certain times where I'm just more predictable, which is using the double cord technique, in my opinion.
Exactly. And I think where having the lab fabricate your crowns, where it outshines the CEREC, is after we do all of this hard work, we can take photos, whether using a DSLR, mirrorless camera, any sort of professional photos that you can send to the lab, along with the scans to, they're going to have the staining. They're going to have the time to sit there and match the shade and really make sure that we have a good aesthetic outcome. Yep. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the CEREC, you're limited in that, right?
Well, you're limited and the CEREC, there's different components to like provisionals with the CEREC, which I think are very convenient and nice. Same thing with like 3D printing. There's a whole nother aspect of like 3D printing provisionals for full arch cases and things like that I think are awesome. But there's certain, you're limited to what your stock is. So you can't keep every single shade in your office. That just doesn't make sense to do that. But a lab is able to have all the different, shades, undertones, colors. I think a good ceramist is someone who really loves sitting there looking at those photos, like those high quality photos, and just finding those little nuances of like, okay, there's a little bit of like modeling around the teeth around it. I want to add these little like white to gray tones because that's what your teeth look like with a CEREC. And obviously if posterior teeth, it's a little bit of a different story, but even in our office, like our posterior teeth look like an aesthetic anterior tooth. Yeah. Because that's just like the caliber of, the clientele we're working with. That's just our standard. And that's just the lab that we work with. They pride themselves in that. And I'm not going to not accept a better quality product, even if it's like, number 15.
Right.
I want that tooth to still look like your natural tooth. I don't want it to be this white, bright, almost like flat
Yeah.
looking restoration.
Yeah, and I think, when I talk about the limitations, it's not so much in the machine itself. There are many other factors that go into how what are you investing in your office? And if you're investing in it, are you investing in the team to know how to use those tools properly? And then are you seeing a return on it? Because you could have every single shade and all of the staining, but if your team doesn't know how to use it or you don't have the time, if the reality of it is you're busy throughout the day and then they're just milling the crown and putting in A1, how's that going to come out and how's it going to look? Versus taking the time to have that seat appointment. And seat appointments, I'll have them blocked off for an hour, but typically,
it's less.
It's less.
But I would schedule an hour.
Yeah, it's like we'll give the patients the time, but it's really not that. It doesn't take that long, especially if you're checking all of the boxes beforehand.
Yep.
Which I think is amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that does come with the communication with the lab because, shade is one thing that I think there can be some nuances of like, hey, that lab technician, even though like I had a implant crown came back recently from a lab that does a really beautiful job. Like they like nail it on just different nuances of our shading. But when I put it in the patient's mouth, and mind you, the patient had like a C1 and then a D2, and then like she had multicolors in every one of her teeth. So that's always a fun case to match because you're trying to match to anterior, posterior, and I'm working in a premolar, which is right between these two things. Right. So I loved that. And so we tried the tooth in the mouth initially, and my assistant did, and it was too bright. And I looked at like, I'm okay, like how do my photos come out? So I looked back at my work first before I'm like calling my lab.
Exactly.
So I looked back at my photos and I was like, no, that it looks, I know which the tab I looked at, I was like, that's exactly what this looks like. I held that tab to the tooth. The tooth was just lighter than that. It was more like a D1 versus a D2.
Yeah.
Mind you, that's a very small difference, but it's a big difference in our world.
Yes.
We work in millimeters, not, centimeters. So a shade being off just ever so slightly is big. So took a new photo with that in the mouth, sent it to my labs, took the same kind of like shade series of photos. And I usually take multiple shade tabs, even though I'm selecting one of them in my notes. And when I'm selecting on the prescription, I'm giving the lab kind of that difference of perspective of, okay, like cervical's here, like this is what it's more like an A3 versus A2 is more incisal. And they can kind of, shade that stuff in and look at the differences of that. So when I had to send it back, she was like, I thought about doing a custom shade for this person because she's a little more particular. I didn't want to do this another time, and it's pretty rare in this situation where this would happen, but we were going to do a custom shade. I emailed her new photos and she's like, no, I see it. She's like, I don't need to have her come in for the, custom shade and all that. And I was like, well, I'm going to trust you. It was a lot of trust to be like, and the patient's from like a little bit out of town. So I was like, okay, she's willing to come in, but if you think you can nail this, then let's do it. And she did. She brought, the next one came back in, we took, whatever, she was happy. So it's just, I think the lab communication is one thing, but also, looking at, and then I think I just learned this in dental school, was like looking at my work first before I'm looking at the lab's results as the reason why something might not go right. And that's just going to make you a better clinician, is just, even if it is a lab thing, like in that situation, yes, like we try to do everything properly, but sometimes things just don't, whatever it is, the stain that day on their end just didn't set right or whatever it may be, who knows, but it's more about that communication and then having a lab that's not going to sit there and like huff and puff about that feedback. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I really think that there are a lot of benefits to same-day crowns for people with, like I said, just anxiety, or maybe their work schedule is crazy, or they're traveling from a far distance, but they really want you to take care of them. Yeah. Offering that same day is great, but there's nothing like the old-fashioned way of having your lab make the crown. And so I'm a big advocate for that. I think they both have their place. But yeah, thank you for sharing your personal experiences with communication with the lab. I think there's a lot of misconception with just because you have the CEREC in office doesn't mean that you're going to have all of the control over the outcomes versus having proper communication and setting up cases for success with the lab. I think both can offer really great solutions long term, but there will be instances where doing a same day solution for a patient will make sense. So I'm not here to say that I hate CEREC crowns, right? I just think they both have their place. And, like you said, just looking at your work and how you could be better every day to provide better outcomes for patients. So thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks.
We'll see you next week.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Don't forget to leave us a comment, rate us, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more great content.